I've always believed my life was picture perfect. I had a loving husband, Mark, and a stable job at one of the most prestigious corporate offices in New York. Mark and I had been married for 8 years, and while our love wasn't as fiery as it once was, I believed we had something solid, something real. Or at least that's what I told myself every night before I fell asleep. Things changed on a rainy Thursday evening. The office was nearly empty, with most of my colleagues gone for the day. I had stayed late to finalize a project that was due the next morning. The quiet hum of the air conditioning and the faint patter of rain against the windows filled the space. I decided to drop the completed files on Ethan's desk. My boss, Ethan, was the type of man who turned heads, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass. He carried himself with a confidence that was both intimidating and alluring, but I had always kept my distance. After all, I was a married woman and Ethan was my boss. As I approached his office, the door was slightly ajar. I knocked softly but didn't hear a response. Assuming he'd already left, I pushed the door open and froze. Ethan stood there, his back to me, a towel slung loosely around his hips. Droplets of water glistened on his tan, muscular back. His wet hair slightly tousled. He had clearly just stepped out of the private shower attached to his office. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I stammered, quickly turning away, my face burning with embarrassment. "Emma," his deep voice stopped me in my tracks. "It's okay. I didn't hear you knock." I turned back, unable to stop myself from glancing at him. He was now pulling on a shirt, the fabric sticking to his damp chest, outlining every inch of his physique. I tried to avert my eyes, but it was as if they had a mind of their own. For a moment our eyes met. His gaze wasn't angry or surprised. It was intense, almost magnetic. It was the kind of look that makes you forget where you are, who you are. My heart raced, and I could feel my palms growing clammy. I just came to drop these off," I managed to say, holding up the folder. He smiled a slow, knowing smile that made my stomach flip. "Thanks, Emma. I'll take a look at them later." I nodded and practically bolted out of his office, my heels clicking against the polished floors. By the time I reached my desk, my heart was still pounding. What was that? Why did I feel this way? That night, I couldn't get Ethan out of my mind. The way his eyes lingered on mine, the way his presence made my skin tingle. It was dangerous, but it was also thrilling in a way I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it was nothing, just an innocent moment that I had blown out of proportion, but deep down I knew better. Something had shifted and there was no going back. If you're hooked already, don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories like this. Trust me, this is only the beginning. I tried to push the memory of that night out of my mind. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a fleeting moment of attraction, something harmless. But the truth was, Ethan was everywhere, in my thoughts, in my dreams, and most dangerously in my everyday life at work. The next morning I walked into the office feeling jittery. I avoided Ethan's gaze during our morning team meeting, focusing instead on my notepad, pretending to jot down notes. But even as I tried to ignore him, I could feel his presence, the weight of his eyes lingering on me. Later that day he stopped by my desk. "Emma," he said casually, leaning against the edge of my cubicle. His voice low enough that only I could hear. "Do you have a minute?" I nodded, trying to appear composed, but my hands trembled slightly as I followed him into his office. He closed the door behind me and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit." I perched on the edge of the chair, clutching my pen like a lifeline. Ethan walked around to his side of the desk, but instead of sitting, he leaned against it, his arms crossed, his eyes locked onto mine. "About last night," he began. My heart leapt into my throat. "I'm so sorry," I blurted out. "I didn't mean to intrude." He held up a hand, silencing me. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." His concern caught me off guard. "I'm fine," I said quickly, though my voice wavered. He smiled, that slow, disarming smile that had been haunting me since last night. "Good. I wouldn't want you to feel uncomfortable around me. The way he said it, his tone so deliberate, so full of unspoken meaning, sent a shiver down my spine. For the next few weeks, our interactions became more frequent, more charged. He'd linger by my desk during lunch breaks, asking about my weekend plans. He'd find reasons to pull me into his office for quick chats that always seemed to last longer than necessary. It was during one of these chats that everything changed. We had both stayed late to finish a project. The office was quiet, the hum of computers the only sound. I was sitting across from him, going over the final details of a report when he reached across the desk and placed his hand over mine. "Emma," he said, his voice low and full of something I couldn't quite place. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. His eyes held mine, and for a moment, the air between us felt electric. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his words sending a thrill through me that I couldn't deny. I knew I should have pulled away. I should have told him this was wrong, that I was married, that we couldn't do this. But instead I leaned in, closing the distance between us. Our first kiss was tentative, almost hesitant, but it quickly deepened, becoming something desperate and consuming. That night marked the beginning of our affair. We became experts at hiding it. Stolen glances in the office, hushed phone calls late at night, secret meetings in his car. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word was a rush, a dangerous thrill that I couldn't get enough of. But as exhilarating as it was, there was always a part of me that felt guilty. Mark didn't deserve this. He was a good man and I hated lying to him, but every time I tried to end things with Ethan, he pulled me back with a look, a touch, a word. The tipping point came one evening when we were in Ethan's office. I was sitting on his desk, my legs dangling over the edge, while he stood between them, his hands resting on my hips. We were so lost in each other that we didn't hear the sound of footsteps outside the door. A knock startled us, and we quickly pulled apart, our hearts racing. Ethan opened the door to find one of our coworkers standing there, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face told me she knew. And for the first time since this all began, I felt the weight of what we were doing, the risk we were taking. Are you on the edge of your seat yet? If you want to know what happens next, don't forget to like and subscribe for more dramatic and captivating tales. I couldn't shake the look on my coworker's face that evening, the way her eyes darted from me to Ethan, the slight smirk she gave as she walked away. It sent a chill down my spine. She knew. There was no way she didn't know. For the next few days, I lived in a state of heightened paranoia. Every time she glanced in my direction, I felt like the walls were closing in on me. She hadn't said anything, but her silence was louder than words. At home, things weren't much better. Mark had started noticing my distance. He wasn't the type to pry, but the tension between us was palpable. "Late night again?" he asked one evening as I walked through the door. "Yeah, the team's been swamped," I replied, avoiding his gaze. Mark didn't push further, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't a fool. One evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, I felt his presence behind me. He leaned over and kissed my cheek. "Who are you texting?" he asked casually, but there was an edge to his voice. "Just a coworker," I lied quickly, locking my screen. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, his tone still light but his eyes sharp. My heart raced. I'd been careless earlier, and there was still a text from Ethan sitting in my messages. I laughed nervously. "It's work stuff, Mark. You wouldn't be interested." He didn't press the issue, but I could see the doubt growing in his expression. At work, Ethan tried to reassure me. "She won't say anything," he said confidently, referring to our coworker. "She has no proof." But his confidence did little to soothe my nerves. I started noticing the way people looked at us, the way conversation seemed to stop when I walked into the break room, the way whispers followed me down the hall. Then the inevitable happened. One night, Mark came home early from his shift. I was in the shower when I heard the familiar ping of my phone. I didn't think much of it until I stepped out and saw Mark sitting on the edge of the bed, my phone in his hand. "Who is Ethan?" he asked, his voice low and steady, but his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. Panic surged through me. "Mark, I can explain," I started, but he cut me off, standing abruptly. "Explain what, Emma? That you've been sneaking around with your boss? That you've been lying to me for God knows how long?" Tears filled my eyes. It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Mark laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You didn't mean for it to go this far? What does that even mean? You didn't accidentally kiss him, Emma. You didn't accidentally have an affair." I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "Mark, please. Love you. This was a mistake. I swear." He held up his hand, silencing me. "Oh, just don't." The pain in his eyes was almost too much to bear. He grabbed his keys and left, slamming the door behind him. That night was the longest of my life. I sat on the couch, replaying everything in my mind, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. I wanted to blame Ethan, to say he had seduced me, but the truth was I had made the choice. The next morning I went to work feeling hollow. Ethan tried to talk to me, but I brushed him off. "It's over," I said, my voice cold and distant. He looked hurt, but I didn't care. I had already lost too much. When Mark finally came home, he didn't say a word. He grabbed a few things and left again. I didn't stop him. What could I say that would make any of this better? The house felt emptier than ever without Mark. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the clock reminded me of the void I had created. I tried calling him, texting him, but he either ignored me or responded with clipped, emotionless words. At work, things were no better. Ethan acted as if nothing had happened, but I could feel the shift. Our once electric connection was now weighed down by guilt and awkwardness. And then there were the whispers, the quiet, biting remarks from coworkers that seemed to follow me wherever I went. The coworker who had seen us that night hadn't kept her knowledge to herself. Soon, the whole office was buzzing with rumors about me and Ethan. Every time I walked into a room, the chatter would die down, replaced by judgmental stares. Ethan tried to smooth things over. "People will move on," he said during one of our rare conversations. "This will blow over." But it didn't. A week later, Mark finally agreed to meet me. He chose a small cafe far from home, and when I arrived, he was already seated, staring into his coffee. "Mark," I began, my voice trembling. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Why, Emma?" he asked. "Was I not enough for you?" Tears welled up in my eyes. "You are enough. You've always been enough. This wasn't about you." "Then what was it about?" he demanded, his voice rising. "What could possibly justify throwing away everything we built?" I reached for his hand, but he pulled back. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I was stupid and selfish, and I got caught up in something I didn't know how to stop." Mark shook his head, his jaw tight. "You didn't know how to stop. How about not starting in the first place?" His words hit me like a slap, and I couldn't hold back the sobs that racked my body. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." He sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Emma. Trust doesn't just come back overnight." "I'll do whatever it takes," I pleaded. "I'll go to therapy. I'll quit my job. Just tell me what I can do." Mark didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "I need time and space. This isn't something I can decide right now." The days that followed were agonizing. I threw myself into fixing what I could. I resigned from my job, cutting all ties with Ethan. It wasn't easy. He tried to convince me to stay, promising things would get better, but I knew it was the right thing to do. At home, I packed away the reminders of my old life, the photos of Mark and me, the little trinkets we'd collected over the years. I didn't want to forget him, but I also couldn't bear the constant reminders of what I had ruined. Weeks turned into months, and slowly Mark and I began to communicate again. At first, it was just polite exchanges about bills or shared responsibilities, but gradually the walls started to come down. One evening he came over to talk. We sat on the couch, the same couch where we had spent so many happy nights. And for the first time in a long time we had an honest conversation. "I'm not saying things will go back to the way they were," he said, "but I'm willing to try for us." Tears streamed down my face as I nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." Rebuilding our relationship wasn't easy. Took time, patience, and a lot of painful conversations. But through it all, I held on to the hope that we could find our way back to each other. Looking back, I know I made a terrible mistake. I hurt the person I loved most in the world, and there's no excuse for that. But I also learned the value of honesty, of communication, of not taking the people you love for granted. If there's one thing I'd say to anyone listening, it's this: don't let fleeting moments of temptation destroy what truly matters. And if you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful and emotional tales.